Nobody knew what had happened with Vicky. She just was at the bus stop one minute and then wasn't at the bus stop.
You want to know if she's alive or if she's dead.
Your sister Vicky, how did her disappearance affect your mother?
It took 2 years, but it killed her.
Back then, none of us had any idea how inextricably linked those two families would become.
We are members of a special club nobody wants to be in.
Fears are growing for the safety of a young Polish woman who's been missing for 3 days.
Right at the very start, nobody knew what a big story it was going to be.
As you will be aware, the body that was found within St Patrick's Church was that of Angelika Kluk.
The prospect of going down under the floorboards filled me with dread, to be honest.
Sadly, I have to inform you, Angelika's death has now been treated as murder.
It was immediately apparent to me that this was a sexually motivated murder.
Well, today, detectives released a photograph of a man they want to talk to.
Peter Tobin.
Peter Tobin.
Peter Tobin, a volunteer worker at Angelika's church, was arrested in London.
As soon as I saw what Tobin had done to Angelika, I thought, he's 60 years of age. This is not the first time he is killed.
This is a Scotland Yard murder bag. It's been at the scene of violent death hundreds of times. Now, although the murder squad itself was formed in 1906, over the past 5 years, the success rate has been 95%. What do you put that down to, Inspector?
Well, as the years pass, forensic science becomes better and better, and the fingerprint departments are becoming better and better. We can solve murders today which maybe 50 years ago would have been unsolvable purely from the scientific angle.
My specialism is in the recovery of fingerprints. That's been happening for over 100 years. Started off with powders, but what we do is much more scientific and much more based on a better understanding of what's happening both within the fingerprint and what is potentially present. Effectively, there are friction ridges on your hands and your feet, and as you sweat, the sweat sticks to the ridges, and when you touch a surface, you leave an invisible or latent impression. Sweat is 98–99% water, with the other 1 or 2% being different chemicals and compounds, and those are the things that we target. Those chemicals have an interaction with the surface in a manner that you can potentially recover any fingerprints on those surfaces. Almost like the ghost impression of where those fingers had touched. There are circumstances where fingerprints can last for a significant number of years, and that's why we still look at items for cold cases. It is a huge buzz when you find something that helps paint a picture or helps add to a story, particularly when that story is pointing towards a serial killer.
The investigation into the murder of the Polish student Angelika Kluk is continuing tonight. Major forensic work has been underway since the body of the 23-year-old was found hidden beneath the floorboards of the church.
So he was brought back to Scotland. And then, later on in that week, we got the DNA identification.
We searched the Scottish DNA database first and we got no match at all. So we then searched the national DNA database and that's when we got a named match. And the match came back against Peter Tobin.
That is the start, because you have to think ahead. And they knew what would come up at the court. Consensual sexual intercourse, that's why his DNA would be there. So you had to go and prove beyond reasonable doubt that Tobin had killed Angelica.
We've established where Angelica had been murdered, which was within the garage of the church, but we never established a pool of blood. We couldn't pinpoint the exact area she must have been lying and bleeding. And we couldn't work out how she got down the hatch without any blood getting transferred onto the hatch because it's such a tight space. Her body was actually wrapped in a tarpaulin. So the tarpaulin became really interesting.
The tarpaulin was submitted to us after the biological samples had been taken off it to recover the fingerprints from it. So we did recover fingerprints, we photographed them, and then we send the file and a print.
What the machine does, it allows us to put the image of the mark that we want to look at underneath, and it brings it up on this plate here. The other side is the fingerprint form taken from the suspect or the accused. To identify this mark as having been made by this person, we have to find sufficient characteristics in each of the marks which appear in the same place on each. And the one that looks as if it's quite busy with characteristics, and I'm looking at ridges here, and we always go from one side to the other side.
There was a significant number of fingerprints found that were subsequently identified to Peter Tobin. None of them were particularly significant in terms of the position of them. There was just so many of them, but that in itself, being so many belonging to Peter Tobin and little or none belonging to anyone else, was in itself reasonably significant.
During the post-mortem, there'd been small bits of wood found in Angelica's skull. And we had a table leg submitted into the laboratory for examination. There was 4 of them. One of them did have blood. We sampled that. It matched Angelica Kluk's DNA profile. So we were able to give the opinion that in the whole context of everything, most likely this had been the weapon used to strike her.
There was an overwhelming forensic case against Tobin starting to build up. We had his fingerprints, his blood-stained clothing. There was some DNA, some blood on the watch that he still had on him.
So there was a lot of evidence of her on him and him on her. So really powerful stuff.
A man appeared at Glasgow Sheriff Court this afternoon charged with the murder of Angelica Kluk. Peter Tobin, who's 60, also faces 2 further charges of attempting to pervert the course of justice. Peter Tobin made no plea or declaration and was remanded in custody.
It was horrible, tragic story of someone like me who moved to Glasgow from Poland and just happened to be in the wrong place.
Tonight in Glasgow, a Catholic Mass for a Polish community grieving the loss of one of their own. The murder of a young student from Gdansk has shocked many.
I think that being a woman and being a migrant adds a lot of vulnerability to your status. She was in a very safe environment, perceived safe environment. She was in the church, and someone asked her for a favor. He was a handyman in a religious community when everyone should feel safe. Surely you will help him because you don't want to be perceived as one of the migrants who is a scrounger, who is being described in the media. And I think that adds to Angelica's vulnerability.
Her sister said Angelica had an extraordinary enthusiasm for life.
I hope that those who met her, had contact with her, will remember her by that. That she was able to pass on that enthusiasm. And in that way, she won't die in your memory. And this is really important to me and to my dad.
So we had Peter Tobin for murder. But as soon as I saw the ferocity of what he'd done and how confident he was that he'd remained at that scene for 2 days, he even gave a statement to the police using his alias, Patrick McLaughlin. How calm and cool is that? This is someone that was organised. And I thought, we've got to look at this individual's life. He's killed before. So Operation Anagram was a very confidential setup. It was a locked room with a team of detectives working away to look at Tobin's whole life, go right back to when he was born and see what else he's done. We traced a lot of his partners, his former wives. His first wife, Margaret, you know, when Margaret talks about what happened to her, she lived a life of hell.
A psychiatrist is a medical doctor that deals with mental illness, and a forensic psychiatrist does that, but specifically with individuals that have a history of violence or offending. So we tend to assess people in courts, in locked psychiatric units, and also in prisons. So when you look at any individual that commits repeated severe violence, that usually is related to a number of factors. Firstly, it's about their own experiences in childhood and adolescence, and a large proportion of these people, who are mostly men, just show the huge lack of empathy. And it also tells us a bit about their personalities. They tend to be quite impulsive, they tend to be quite aggressive, and it also tells us about how they view dynamics in a relationship. So Tobin's wife, Margaret, was very young and very vulnerable when they first met. She was only 17.
When you first met Peter Tobin, he appeared on a visit very charming. I mean, you were pretty much swept off your feet in a sense.
That's correct, yes. He was very gentlemanly. He dressed very nice in a suit, and they just had very good conversation.
But after you'd been out with him for some time, you saw the darker side of him. How did that manifest itself?
So we went up this flat, and then I said, I have to go now, thank you very much, and will I see you again? So I made towards the front door, and he followed in behind me, and then just suddenly as I opened the door, he just slammed it shut and said, no, you're not leaving here. And he just pulled me by the arm and pushed me over into the middle of the floor.
One thing that really stands out is that he's actually quite charming when he first meets his victims, and then he gets them into a scenario or a situation where they're vulnerable.
He kept you a prisoner for quite some time.
Yes, for a good few months when I was in that flat. If I tried to get out or tried to call for help, as it was a tenement, he would shut me up, gag me with his hand, or throw me down on the chair or against a wall.
He controlled different aspects of her life. Not only did he overtly control their interactions by intimidating her, scaring her, and arguing with her, he controlled her ability to literally leave their accommodation and go where she wanted to. So it feels like he tried to almost have a holistic approach in the way that he was controlling her.
He kept a knife.
When he wanted to rape me and I wouldn't consent to it, I eventually got a good dig in the side with a knife.
And I suppose the most serious assault was a very violent assault.
Yes, if it hadn't been for a gentleman below who had seen the blood through his ceiling, I would probably be dead now.
Often when we see domestic violence or any form of severe violence, the reason that there's an escalation is because the perpetrator almost builds up a tolerance. So they need to up the ante, they need to find a higher stimulus to get the same kind of buzz as their first act.
You then went to Brighton, and he forced you to marry him using two of his friends as witnesses because you were at that point still underage under English law.
This all strikes me as somebody who was calm and calculated with a degree of equanimity as opposed to being agitated or scared. And the reason that I think that is clinically significant is that that is one of the key features of being a psychopath.
You started to get a picture of someone that was a controlling individual, someone that was extremely violent. Margaret was a victim of horrendous abuse in the 60s. But it was the 1960s. Where could she go? Where could she get help? Who could she speak to? She had no one to go to.
The wife beater is rarely someone who stands out in a crowd. Most of the women we've spoken to say their friends believed their husbands were charming men.
Husband don't know what he's done. Kids don't know what's wrong with mum. She can't say, they can't see. Putting it down to another bad day.
The problem is one that stretches across the whole social spectrum. And some wives relate a horrifying catalogue of experiences.
So this is how it feels to be lonely. This is how it feels to be small.
Fear is, I used to go to the toilet and be sick. It just were nerves waiting on him coming in.
The scale of the problem was extensive. The United Nations, and we used to use this kind of statistic, would say that maybe between 1 in 3, 1 in 4 women would experience domestic abuse in their lifetime.
Domestic violence, rape, all sorts of crimes against women, they weren't investigated the way they are nowadays.
This is how it feels when your word means nothing at all.
The changes that happened through the 70s and into the 80s that ended up being really quite significant political changes grew out of the women's liberation movement, the feminist movement, and many of those women were survivors of violence, of domestic violence, and then became drawn into this movement which was about learning that what happened to them wasn't their fault, their responsibility, as they were so often being told, not only by perpetrators, but by the kind of messaging of wider society.
The woman should always walk on a well-lit side of the street as opposed to a dark area, where she should arrange to walk with friends if she can, where she should arrange to be met from a late-night function. If all those common-sense precautions were to be taken, the vast majority of offences against women would be avoided.
So this is how it feels to be lonely. This is how it feels to be small.
It was really important to challenge the everyday assumptions, this kind of so-called common sense, that the problem was something that women had to address. So what this new campaign wanted to do was really to turn that on its head and say, who causes the problem? It's not the women, it's a social problem. It's a problem about men's behaviour. I think in that original campaign, there were 64 billboards erected on stands on Princess Street, so they were completely unavoidable. They were in a large number of the bus shelters around town. They're all striking images by Frankie Raffles, and this one shows a woman sitting in a nice, comfortable suburban home. She lives with a successful businessman, loving father, and respected member of the community. Last week, he hospitalised her. This poster really was about saying domestic violence isn't something that just happens in certain kinds of houses or to certain kinds of people. Again, nice middle class, comfy house, 2 little girls playing with their toys. By the time they reach 18, one of them will have been subjected to sexual abuse. From flashing to rape, male abuse of power is a crime. The immediate public impact was significant. People were more aware of the issue. We say it is not acceptable. Violence against women is a crime and we should have zero tolerance for that crime. One of the issues that also was on the agenda was that the criminal justice system wasn't solving the problem, it was part of the problem.
The trial has started of a man accused of raping and murdering a Polish student and hiding her body under a church floor. Peter Tobin, who's 60, denies killing Angelika Kluk at St Patrick's Church in Glasgow last year.
His QC Donald Finlay lodged a special defence that Peter Tobin did have sex with Angelika, but it was with her consent.
There were many, many stories that came out during the Peter Tobin trial. Some of them were very, very salacious.
Angelika's sister Agneta arrives at court on a day dominated by sensational claims of sexual promiscuity.
The defence, they were bringing up aspects of her past, the fact that she'd been having an affair with a married man.
Angelika's married lover, Martin McCaskill, told the court about his last text message from Angelika.
And the fact that the priest had been giving her money and giving her his credit card.
Lots of column inches about the kind of person that Angelika Kluk was.
A court's heard that the murdered Polish student Angelika Kluk was having an affair with the priest of the church where her body was found.
Agneta Kluk described the claim as outrageous and untrue.
But Agneta Kluk did say that Father Nugent was an alcoholic who she described as being a Jekyll and Hyde person.
It was classic, people would say she was flirting, she was having an affair with a married man. All of that, you know, all of that kind of attention on her.
In front of me, I have 11 of the headlines talking about her sexuality. It should be about a horrible crime and securing her dignity. And it feels like she was really stripped of that. She was more than this. So I'm not surprised that the dad said that she hasn't been killed once, but she has been killed twice. When she was murdered and when her reputation was destroyed. I cannot even imagine and put myself into a shoe of her dad and her sister, the way that it might make them feel.
Vladislav Kluk left court having told the jury how his daughter Angelika was a brilliant student and devoted Catholic who loved living in Scotland. He last spoke to her 3 days before she went missing.
In this case, it did rest quite heavily on the forensic evidence because there was a lot of forensic evidence. So I ended up spending 2.5 days in the witness box.
The Angelika Kluk murder trial has had forensic evidence linking the Polish student with Peter Tobin, the man accused of her killing.
DNA taken from semen recovered from Miss Kluk's body had been, according to tests, a complete match for Peter Tobin's.
The main thrust of the defence was that Angelika and Peter Tobin had been in a consensual sexual relationship, that they'd had intercourse and he had left her and then someone had come along and murdered her.
The jury's also been told about a fingerprint from Mr Tobin being found on tape used to gag her.
Because it wasn't sticky tape, we knew there was a really good opportunity to recover DNA from that partial mark. And that's what happened.
The probability of the DNA profile originating from another male unrelated to Peter Tobin is estimated to be around 1 in 1 billion.
Peter Tobin has been found guilty of the rape and murder of the Polish student Angelika Kluk at a church in Glasgow last September.
After 6 weeks, the jury took 3.5 hours to decide he was guilty. The killer had shown little emotion. Then, as he left to face a punishment period behind bars of 21 years, Tobin lashed out at the photographer.
I think that was the first time the public duly got an opportunity to see the real character behind Peter Tobin. It was good to see that he got that justice, because there's no doubt in my mind and in the minds of any of the police officers that had investigated Tobin's past, that he would have gone on to kill and kill and kill again.
court has been told that the man who murdered the Polish student Angelika Kluk had been on the run from Strathclyde Police for almost a year before he killed her.
My first involvement in the story was I was just asked to look into Peter Tobin's background because he was a sex offender on the run when he killed Angelika Kluk, so I was asked to look at that, what had gone wrong.
Peter Tobin was convicted of raping and murdering Angelika Kluk 3 weeks ago, but for legal reasons, this part of the story could not be told until today. In 1994, Tobin was jailed in England for 14 years for an horrific attack on 2 girls aged 14 and 15.
He abducted 2 teenage girls, got them into his flat.
Police were first alerted when the 2 girls went missing on Wednesday evening. The older girl returned home early the following morning and told her parents that both she and her friend had been sexually assaulted.
He left them with the gas on in the flat. They survived the attack, but it had a dreadful effect on both of them. Tobin went on the run. I think he was on the run for 40 days.
When he was released from jail, Tobin came to live in Paisley. As a registered sex offender, he had to inform the police if he was changing his address. In October 2005, there was an alleged incident involving Tobin and a young woman.
He had been accused of attacking someone, and that's why he went on the run from Paisley. That's why he disappeared and fell off the radar and assumed a false name and ended up in the church where he murdered Angelika Kluk.
The High Court was told the police made extensive inquiries throughout the UK in 2005 and 2006, but they never traced Peter Tobin. It was only after he had murdered Angelika Kluk that they found him hiding in a hospital in London under a false name.
This headline here, The Betrayal of Angelika, and the story describes the catastrophic failure of the criminal justice system, which allowed Peter Tobin to remain on the run for over a year. These registers are there for a reason. They're supposed to protect the public, and we found time and time again that they don't keep tabs on them all, and it allows predators like Tobin to continue to operate and pop up again and again, and operate in one part of the country and pop up in another where they start all over again.
This is someone that travelled throughout the UK. He was someone that was mobile, someone that used false names. And we started to find out very quickly they had lots of addresses. Everywhere in this map here, the UK, he knew exactly what he was doing. He was working at places where vulnerable people were. And this is an individual that looked respectable, suits and ties, someone that people described as Mr. Nice Guy. He was a groomer. When we looked at his life, we had a timeline where he was at different times, and it soon became missing people that we're looking at. Every single police force in the UK was reviewing their missing people and undetected murders and rapes. If he was in an area, the police force in that area would want to know if he had any connection to their missing people, and they would look at them and review them. Very quickly established that in 1991, Tobin lived at a house, Robertson Avenue in Bathgate. Everyone remembered that that was the time Scotland's highest profile missing person, Vicky Hamilton, had disappeared.
Peter Tobin didn't feature in the original missing person inquiry at all. There was nothing there, and I recall when I went through a lot of the house-to-house side of things, he wasn't the subject of a house-to-house visit either. That area was out with the parameters that they'd decreed at the time, just out with it.
So Lothian Borders Police, they actually reviewed that missing person, and very quickly there was a potential opportunity. When Vicky Hamilton disappeared, her purse had been found at a bus station in Edinburgh.
When we submitted that and a detailed analysis was carried out on the purse, they found traces of saliva, which ultimately was traced and was found out to be the DNA relating to Peter Tobin's son. That was a major surprise. He'd probably been sucking in his mouth the corner of it, and it's from that area there that this DNA came from.
That is familial DNA that links directly to Peter Tobin. That's evidence, 100% evidence to link Tobin to Vicky Hamilton.
When Tobin was brought back to court to be sentenced for going on the run as a registered sex offender, I went along to cover that small part of the story, and while I was there, somebody mentioned to me that they were going to search a house in Bathgate in connection with the disappearance of Vicky Hamilton. And, you know, I was just astonished because it was Vicky Hamilton.
In 2006, when the news broke of a Polish girl going missing in Glasgow, it was just one of these, oh, right, okay, here we go again, switch the news off, because it was just too close to home, a missing girl. And I don't think we really took much notice of it until we got a phone call and they were like, we need to come down and speak to you. And I don't think we quite registered just how serious it was, because I think after 17 years, I think we kind of, as a family, we just assumed that we would never find out what had happened to Vicky. It was just always just going to be a missing persons case.
When Vicky Hamilton disappeared, Peter Tobin was living at Robertson Avenue in Bathgate. The street has been cordoned off as the most detailed, meticulous search of its kind in the history of Lothian and Borders Police gets underway.
It was clearly big news, it was a big story, and in the weeks that followed, the house in Robertson Avenue in Bathgate was searched by Lothian and Borders Police.
What came out of that surprised a lot of people. There were lots of personal items relating to Peter Tobin in the attic space, of little relevance from an investigative perspective. However, what the forensic teams did recover was a knife, and that knife, when it was forensically examined, it showed traces, and there was tissues which was identified as being from Vicky Hamilton.
When we saw in the news about the tent going up in his back garden and the forensic scientists in there, I think we collectively knew something had been found. I don't think we were hoping that Vicky would be there. I don't think we really wanted to even just say it out loud what could potentially be happening now. The police couldn't tell us much for obvious reasons.
You could see how the case is now progressing. You're moving away from clearly all thoughts of a missing person inquiry and into a murder victim inquiry.
But we were always worried that, well, without a body, could they convict? We never kind of wanted to hope that something would come from it until she was found.
At that time, inquiries started to look at other missing people, and the focus was on Dinah McNichol. And Dinah McNichol went missing from way down here. She'd been at the Lip Hook Festival. They'd been hitching a lift, got a lift from a Scottish person. The description he gave of the Scottish man fitted Peter Tobin, and the car fitted one of the cars that Tobin had at that time. So start making inquiries, and it was found her bank card had been used at cash machines all the way along the coastal line to get to Kent. Tobin, he had a house at Irvine Drive in Margate in Kent. Officers from the team spoke to neighbours. One of the neighbours actually remembered them. I remember Scottish Pete.
I looked over the fence one day and saw him digging this massive hole in the garden. And I said, what are you doing, Pete? He said, I'm digging a sandpit for the lad when he comes up, somewhere for him to play. And I thought no more of it. I thought, well, that's going to be a big sandpit.
So they put all that together, thought about it very hard and decided to investigate that house and dig up the back garden.
That was the thing with the Angelika Kluk murder and Operation Anagram. There were so many sad twists and turns, things you were never prepared for.
I was aware that they were carrying out the searches in Margate, and when it became known that they'd found human remains, I spoke to someone connected with the police in Edinburgh and asked whether I should go to Margate, and they said yes. I went to Margate that day and drove to Irvine Drive. There was a lot of media there. I seem to remember the weather was pretty bad. You know, when you arrive at something like that and the network television broadcasters are there, you know, it was clear you were walking into a major news story.
I was at college. I was at college and I'd came out of my class and I'd got a phone call saying you have to come to Sharon's right now.
The police in Essex went to Tobin's old house in Margate thinking they might find Dinah McNichol, and to their astonishment and to everyone's astonishment, they found Vicky Hamilton.
We just all burst into tears.
It was just incredible, you know. The idea that Vicky Hamilton, who disappeared in Scotland, this 15-year-old girl, was in the back garden of a house at the other end of the UK. It was just astonishing, mind-blowing, grim. You thought, how on earth, all these years she's been here in somebody's back garden? I remember standing trying to do a live report in Margate and not really knowing what to say.
The house in Irvine Drive in Margate is just over 370 miles from where Vicky Hamilton was last seen in the centre of Bathgate in 1991.
When we got told Vicky had been found, it was just shock and complete disbelief. And then once the feelings kind of dissipated, it kind of came to realise, hang on, why is she in a back garden 400 miles away? What had happened for her to be there? And then realisation kind of set in that her final moments must have been horrendous.
You know, it emerged that he must have murdered her in Bathgate, and then a number of weeks later taken her body to the south of England in bin bags in his car.
For years, this hole in the ground has been the resting place of Vicky Hamilton.
Then when the evidence came out about how she'd been bisected and how she'd been wrapped up, and that brought up a whole new sense of feelings of, whereas ignorance was maybe a bit bliss, where we could just say she'd went missing. But then realising she had died on February the 10th when she was 15-year-old.
I've lost any faith or track into trying to fathom out the mindset of an individual like Peter Tobin, how they think and what they do. No, there is no formula that you can come up with to work out why they do something and what you can do to countermand that.
It was a very, you know, as a reporter, you're there, you know it's a news story, you're there to do your job, but it was very upsetting. You knew that the family, after all those years of horrible tortures, you know, uncertainty, they had, I don't think closure's ever the right word to use, but they had her back.
There was relief. In fact, it was suddenly good that she'd been found. the end was in sight to the nightmare. We could give her a send-off, we could have a place to say goodbye, and she could finally be with Mum, wherever that is.
For police search teams, this has been a gruelling job.
It has been a long week of intense physical work. The team, encouraged by yesterday's sad discovery, is determined to continue with this for as long as it takes to complete the task we came here to do.
Peter Tobin's former home in Margate will be stripped bare by the police. They still believe the remains of another missing teenager, Dinah McNichol, could be here.
Well, I mean, I'm looking for Dinah McNichol. I came here looking for Dinah McNichol. I had reasons to come here. We found Vicky, but I don't know where Dinah is yet. But clearly, I still think she's linked to this house in some way.
I'd heard Dinah McNichol's dad on the radio. I was down in Margate, heard him on the local radio station. He was Scottish, because I was from a Scottish station. I got in touch with him. So I went to see him, and he was a lovely guy. He was an old jazz musician. That was why Dinah was called Dinah, after Dinah Washington. And we set up to interview in his house. And we were speaking about Dinah, about what she was like and what had happened when she went missing and the impact it had on all the family.
When a member of your family actually goes missing, it's 20 times worse than death, because you do not know a thing.
The doorbell went, and it was one of my colleagues from the local ITV station in that part of England who told us that another body had been found.
There's been a significant development here. Another human body has been found. It's been removed to the mortuary this afternoon, where we'll be conducting a post-mortem this evening.
So I said to Ian, look, should we start recording again? And he said, yeah, and he sat back down in his armchair. And I said to him something like,
the police in the last hour have said that they have definitely found more human remains there.
If they've said that, please be Dinah and get us out of this misery.
To watch a dad who had spent all these years wondering where his daughter was, and he was hoping that she'd be in the back garden of this guy's house. How bad would things have to be that you would hope your daughter was in a murderer's back garden? Because, as he said, it would put them out of their misery finally.
Please let it be Dinah.
And I think that encapsulated, the cruelty of Peter Tobin for me. That they put people in these situations where such a horrific, dreadful, just incomprehensibly cruel act gets them in this situation where hearing that they've been found in the back garden in a shallow grave is actually something that they welcome.
All week long they've been searching. Now they've found 2 bodies that may have lain here undisturbed for 16 years until now. And the question being asked here and elsewhere, perhaps louder than ever now, is could there be any more?
The whole thing was just very, very strange and shocking.
More than 17 years after schoolgirl Vicky Hamilton disappeared, a handyman has gone on trial for her murder.
The system in England is different from Scotland. In Scotland, we don't have opening speeches by the prosecution, and there are very strict rules about what the jury can be told about somebody's previous convictions. So when Peter Tobin was put on trial for murdering Vicky Hamilton, the jury wasn't told they'd been convicted of murdering Angelika Kluk. They weren't told that the man in the dock was already a convicted murderer.
It was very nerve-wracking for the family. What if he was found not guilty? And we're right back to square one.
Peter Tobin denies the abduction and murder of Vicky Hamilton. He's lodged a special defensive alibi.
The doubt started to creep in, especially when we heard that they might be he had an alibi, potentially for that night, claiming he wasn't in Bathgate. We were warned that we might not want to sit in when evidence was read about her final moments. And I think collectively as a family we decided no, we had to listen to it.
Members of Vicky Hamilton's family attended the trial today, and it was decided the photographs of what the police discovered were too sensitive to be displayed on television screens around the courtroom. They began by showing a rectangular-shaped hole in the ground. At the bottom of the hole was a layer of concrete. Beneath that, a layer of chalk, and beneath that, 2 black bin bags with something inside. The bin bags were opened, revealing more bags underneath, like a Russian doll. Finally, the last photograph showed a green bag that had been opened to reveal part of a head.
And they actually, 17 years after she was buried, they managed to find fingerprints on the bin bags.
We received 3 black bin bags that Vicky Hamilton had been in. The innermost layer of those bags was really badly contaminated, but the outermost bag was cleanest because there had been less of that contamination from the decomposing body parts, and potentially a fingerprint has survived.
I just remember maybe somebody notifying us that there were some prints coming in that were recovered on items in connection with the recovery of the bodies. The bags obviously being so old, I don't think it was expected that anything would be found on them.
So the particular technique that was used for these black bin bags was a technique called vacuum metal deposition. So I've taken a black bin bag, and to all intents and purposes it didn't look like there was any fingerprints on it. I've put it through the process, found fingerprints, and made the invisible visible. It was a surprise, a very pleasant surprise that we were able to find fingerprints on it at all. And the fact that those fingerprints were subsequently identified to Peter Tobin was very pleasing.
The fingerprints of the man accused of murdering schoolgirl Vicky Hamilton were found on one of the plastic bags containing part of her body. That's the evidence put before a jury at the High Court in Dundee this afternoon.
The overwhelming evidence was he was guilty, but it was still nerve-wracking, thinking there is still a chance. Even if it's not guilty, there could still be a not proven verdict. And then where do we go from there?
Remember the day of the verdict, it was snowing, which is very striking. Everybody remembered that it was snowing when Vicky Hamilton went missing. And we could see the family walking up the hill to the High Court in Dundee through the snow.
Snow was lying as Peter Tobin was brought into court to face justice, just as it was nearly 18 years ago.
I felt physically sick. Part of me even wanted to run away in case it doesn't go the way that we wanted it to go. So when we sat down, they asked the jury if they came up with a verdict. And then when they said guilty, I think first minute, I felt like forever, but I think first minute it was just silence. And then this overwhelming relief, it was over.
Well, there were cheers and shouts as Peter Tobin was convicted of the murder of Vicky Hamilton. It was a great moment of relief for her family, who had waited for many, many years to find out what had happened to their little girl.
I think me and Lee and Sharon just clung to each other and we just burst into tears.
As Tobin left the dock, there was a shout of "Rotten hell."
And then we had to get ready to go out and read the statement. All these flashes of cameras and people shouting at you, and you're trying to act like your whole world hadn't just again changed for like the 5th time.
Justice has prevailed today. We are glad this 17-year-long nightmare has finally come to an end. We are hoping we can now move on as a family and start to remember Vicky as the loving sister she was before she was so tragically and cruelly taken from us. Vicky's abduction also robbed us of her mum Jeanette, who never came to terms with the fact that Vicky never came home that night, and who died of a broken heart 2 years later, never knowing what happened to her daughter.
Reading that statement outside the court was extremely important, and personally it was really important. I don't know if Angelika Kluk's family were watching it.
We would also like to take this opportunity to offer our condolences to the family and friends of Angelika Kluk. They're in our thoughts today, as it was only after her death that we eventually found out what happened to her sister.
We knew their sacrifice.
Vicky was much more than the girl who was abducted and killed by a stranger, or a girl on a missing poster. Our sister was warm, clever, generous, and we will always remember Vicky as she lived, not as she died. Thank you.
It might sound to some people a weird thing, but at the court case, I was fascinated by how the evidence pinpointed Vicky's murderer. How was it still there after 17 years? And I decided at that point that could be something I would like to do. So I went and got my qualifications, which I never thought I would do. And I did part of it to make my mum and Vicky proud. And when I got my qualifications, I decided to stay on. I absolutely loved education, I loved learning, and I found out that that's exactly what Vicky was like. Vicky loved learning, she always had her nose in a book, and I'm exactly the same. Eventually went to university, got my degree, and I went straight into teaching forensic science. So I do teach the next generation about the basics of sciences and principles, about DNA, the history behind fingerprinting. That was the future, in making sure that other families managed to get closure and justice for anything that happened to their loved ones.
The case of Peter Tobin was almost unique in many ways. He was just about the most evil and wicked man that I've ever had to cross swords with in a criminal court, and I've done over 100 murder cases. He seemed to have absolutely no morals, no remorse, and we could only conclude murdered for pleasure.
I think the way they measure whether you're a serial killer is you have to have 3 victims or more. So when Dinah was found, that meant he had 3 victims. So he was, regarded as a serial killer.
It was not a difficult trial to prosecute. In truth, the evidence was completely and utterly overwhelming. He had a previous conviction for a similar murder, and the body of Diana was found in his garden, where people had seen him at the time of her disappearance digging a hole. I honestly think a law student could have comfortably obtained the conviction of Peter Tobin on the evidence that we had, and it never crossed my mind for a second that he could be acquitted.
I think the jury took 9 minutes to come back with a guilty verdict.
I have never known a verdict in a murder trial returned so quickly. But for the family that was there and throughout the trial, I think there was an element of relief that their ordeal had finally ended, and it was painful to watch them throughout the trial, holding hands and looking at the man who had murdered her.
Peter Tobin, a man already convicted of murdering 2 young women, has been found guilty of a 3rd murder, and police fear he may be linked to dozens of other murders, making him one of the country's worst serial killers.
There was a huge amount of speculation linking him to other missing person cases around the UK, and there was a huge amount of work done to see whether he could be linked to any other missing person cases.
When Peter Tobin left the church in Glasgow, he left in a hurry. He left some of his own belongings aside at the church. And there was a small bag, and in that bag was women's jewellery.
35 items of jewellery were found in Tobin's possession. None of his ex-wives has claimed them.
The police were wondering whether these were, trophies for a serial killer, whether this is things he'd taken from people he'd murdered.
The police passed on items that had been in his possession, and there was female profiles from several of those items, and they were used going forward in Operation Anagram to see if they could be tied up with any missing persons.
The jewellery, the searches in the south of England, and the huge effort that they put into trying to find out whether there were any other victims, unfortunately didn't yield any further results.
And that's the sad thing. I have no doubt he has killed other people. And you always hope one day the DNA profiles may be matched. And I know that Carol still lives in hope.
Since I've been doing this job, the advancements in DNA have been incredible. However, there's still a long way to go. There's even research going on. Can we take a DNA profile and tell what someone would look like? Could you imagine that? What we can do with it now is incredible, but I'm really excited to see what we can do in the future, and the next generation of people doing this job can come and give us the answers that we aren't able to find at the moment.
You know, as journalists, you're supposed to try and keep away from getting too involved in stories. But when you cover something like the crimes of Peter Tobin, I developed a real hatred for him. And when I heard the news that he died, I was pleased. And to be totally honest, I hope it wasn't pleasant for him. I'd seen the impact that his utterly horrific and evil and wicked crimes had had on really nice people who didn't deserve it. So I was pleased when he died.
When we look at Peter Tobin as an individual, in all intents and purposes, he comes across as a very ordinary, normal man. So I think it's important that we don't glamorise him or put him up on this pedestal. And we always have to remember the horrendous damage that he did to the victims and their families.
The way I tried to report the story was just try and keep it to the facts and try not forget the victims, because I think there is a tendency in all stories about serial killers to talk about the killer rather than the victims. And they shouldn't be forgotten, should they?
When someone goes missing, everything else changes. There's a huge ripple effect. Looking back, they had their whole life ahead of them and they were never allowed to grow up. Vicky would be 50 next year. So what would she be? I don't think being a serial killer victim is the legacy that she should have. She's not here and she should be here, but she was taken from us.